Our Plant Stories has been nominated as a finalist in the Independent Podcast Awards in a new category called Environment and Natural World. I'll let you know how we get on. Thanks to all those who are regular supporters of the podcast with their commitment to buying a monthly coffee. And to Anne, who also sent some caffeine my way this month, all of which goes towards paying for this podcast, the hosting platform and the editing programme. The link is in the show notes. And now, a plant story. Welcome to Our Plant Stories and an offshoot episode. In Kathy's Radishes, we heard about the power of growing food to feed yourself.
It's something about self-sufficiency, even if it's just in radishes. It's something about knowing that you did it and now it's on your plate and you're eating it. Flowers are lovely, but you pick them and put them in a vase. Yeah, the end. Sorry, flowers.
Kathy Slack, whose cookbook is called From the Veg Patch. And if you haven't heard her plant story, then I would urge you to take a listen, because those radishes and other vegetables pulled her out of a very dark place. And I think her passion for vegetables is infectious. I have now grown and eaten my first radish slammer, thanks to Kathy, and I'm seeing radishes in a whole different light. In the conversation part of the episode, we heard from Lally Snow, who has just published a book called My Family and Other Seedlings. It details a year on an allotment assisted by 3 under 5s. She begins by imagining balmy afternoons spent with Harry 3 and Ottilie 2. We would harvest carrots and radishes, pick lettuce leaves and water beans and sweet peas amid clouds of butterflies, while 6-month-old baby Kit gurgled contentedly in his pram, marvelling at the sights, sounds and smells of nature's cinema. I'll leave you to read the book for the reality, but for me it had laugh-out-loud moments. The book also looks at the history of allotments. Lally goes back to the 18th century and the Land Enclosure Acts, through the Victorian era, through world wars and pandemics, to the state of play today, looking at our relationship with these small patches of land on which to grow food. I began by asking her where the idea for the book had come from.
Well, I mean, I had spent the best part of my 20s and 30s doing interesting things in foreign places as a journalist, and then moved back to England in search of some rootedness and started a family with my husband. And although living in this rural slice of England was really, really beautiful and lovely, you know, throughout COVID and then the early years of motherhood, I felt very, very hemmed in. And I'd always walked past the village allotment sites on the way to the swing slides in the village, and they didn't seem to be hugely in use, and some of them looked like they were doing a pretty good job as pretending to be a field. And this was all at quite a pivotal moment in the country, with the rising cost of living. We'd just come out of 2 years of COVID. There was war on the brink, war bristling in eastern Ukraine. It hadn't yet started yet. And I just thought, well, you know, when I was researching War Gardens, which is my first book, people were creating these oases of calm in the middle of no man's land, creating something out of a dusty patch of nothing. And okay, right, we weren't living in the middle of a war zone, but I thought, well, you know, if they can do it, surely, you know, could I do it? There's some land here that nobody's using. Could I take on an allotment, never done it before, with 3 small children, and make a dent in our weekly shop, combat the rising cost of living, teach my children how to grow vegetables or learn with them, and occupy their little minds with something a bit different? And that's really how it came about.
And the book, My Family and Other Seedlings, is that because as a writer, you just have to write about things? You like writing about things? Is that part of your process of processing things as well?
Well, yeah, I think it is actually. I think I've always kept a diary anyway for as long as I can remember. And it just helps to kind of unpack your thoughts and unpack your day. And it's also really good at helping you remember things. In fact, many a time my husband and I had a fight, and I've said, well, actually, no, it was on the 5th of May. I wrote it down. So it's a way of processing and remembering as well. And because the early years of childhood, although immensely frustrating can be as a parent, they're very fleeting and they're very precious. And so it was a lovely way to note down those very sort of fleeting years of innocence. Yeah,
It'll be wonderful to have that record. I
yeah.
confess I sometimes try to write things down and then it stopped. Child number 2 says, how come you wrote child number 1's words down and sentences down, and where are mine? So so well done you. Well done you. How is the allotment right now? Before we dig into the history of allotments, we're in May. How is your allotment now?
Well, in truth be told, I've moved house, and we moved house a month ago, and to move house at the beginning of the growing season is not great for an allotment that has had very little care and attention over the winter months, apart from some manure slung over the place. And I went back, I did plant some broad beans to overwinter, and I've got one artichoke has survived the frost, and I've got some raspberries in there as well. And I'm afraid it's really kind of returned to its original state. And it's pretty sad actually, because funnily enough, sort of rereading bits of the book, which was, written 2 years ago or started 2 years ago, it's very nostalgic, and it really does feel like the allotment of my children's infancy. And it's a funny thing about kind of leaving home and then going back home and never quite achieving or attaining that sense of what was there before. But I've been really positive since moving into a bigger but very much grottier house. There's an old vegetable patch at the back of the garden. It's kind of next to a rubbish pit. And the first thing I did when we moved in with all the packing boxes was to lay them down over the weeds, leave them for a couple of weeks, and then start digging. And I cut back a massive thorny bush. I think it's got like 1.5 inch long spikes, and put some logs in there for the children to sit. They're not so keen on it because of the spikes and the thorns and the nettles. And then I found an old piece of slate that somebody had previously written on, and then wrote on it, "Our allotment," in kind of garish bright letters, because the children kept on saying when we first moved in, "Oh, I want to go back to the old house. I want to go to the allotment." So we've made it, and then I've just been digging it over, and I've planted all the things. I've recreated our allotment basically here, and then around. We'll see what happens. I don't know what the soil's like. I haven't done any tests. I haven't fertilized it. I haven't put manure down, and I've cheated, and because it's been so cold and nothing's propagated, I've gone and bought some plugs from the garden centre and from people selling veg.
I don't think that's cheating. I think that's fine. And I love that you've sown the seed of excitement in your children already, that they're saying, when are we going to the allotment? And now you'll just have to go out your back door. Genius. Yeah. It's all good. It's all good.
Good. I'm surrounded by wild garlic, so it'll probably be taken over by that quite soon.
So when you wrote this book, it weaves the stories of your family and your year on the allotment. And I have to tell you, one of my favourite moments is when you've been shown how to thin out carrots, and your 2-year-old thins out every single carrot and is very proud of what she's done, which I think is just a great moment. But it also took you into looking at the history of allotments in the UK. What can you tell us about that? How does that all come about? Where does it come from?
Well, I was really surprised actually, because I think what we normally think of as an allotment and how it looks probably comes from the world wars, because that's when we there's very famous propaganda, or not home front campaigns of dig for victory, and in the First World War it was dig for Dora, defence of the Realm Act. And England was on the brink of starvation with U-boats amassing and under the seas. But actually, allotments go way back further, to another 200 years or so. And it was in the 1800s, so the population expanded up to, I think it was 16.5 million people in 300 years. And that's all well and good. Think populations do expand. But there was a very real hunger for people, and people needed feeding. They were on the brink of starvation. So this is when land reform started to come into play, and land was obviously a commodity. Arable farming became much more of a commodity. Up until then, and up until about the 1750s, there'd been an open field system of farming, which was much more collective. Villagers would go and, have a cow and borrow some wheat from this person. It was bartering and exchange. When this was taken away by the Enclosures Acts, there are 4,000 of them in 100 years, people were even more hungry and more in more need of having to either fend for themselves by going to the cities to work or reliant on their landlords. And 1770, the lord of the manor in Tewkesbury noticed that people who had land attached to their cottages tended to look after them more, those without. And he set aside 5 acres of land to be used by the poor. And the result was that the poor rate was drastically reduced. People started to take note of this. Now, there was a young writer, traveller, sort of farmer, called Arthur Young, who went to France to look at what land reform was going on there. And France at that time was on the brink of revolution. But he came back and, having seen angry and dispossessed agricultural workers, convinced that the way to help struggling labourers was to re-enfranchise them, give them back a right to land, and put forward a series of revolutionary ideas for people with 8 or more children for free use of lots of land. All of this was blocked in Parliament. They didn't want any of this to do with this. However, it started the seed of something. And people started to realise that giving land to the poor, they had an improved diet, a source of hope, dignity, independence, and it would also teach the next generation to maintain these agricultural skills. And another very real reason to keep providing labourers with land was to keep them sober, because bored, drunk and dispossessed labourers equalled a revolution, and nobody wanted a revolution on their hands. So in 1806, George III also created some allotments in Wiltshire in Somerford. A field of around 6 acres became the first free gardens for use by farm labourers, and that was really the first rural allotment. Now this was all against the backdrop of some political and social upheaval. The Industrial Revolution was underway, the threshing machine was in use, labourers were getting out of work. The swing riots that took place, there were lots of bad harvests in the early late 1820s to 30s, and they flamed across the country. Punishments for rioters were very harsh. They were executed or sent off to Australia. And then on the back of the riots, the Labourers' Friends Society concluded that giving land back to individuals was a powerful means of bettering the conditions of the working classes. By 1856, there were an estimated 100,000 plots in existence. This is a huge about turn of events in just 50 years.
And are they all in the countryside? Are these in the countryside rather than in cities at this point?
These were all in the countryside. So in the cities, something else was happening. They were increasingly populated by people leaving the country in search of work. And landlords worked out that there was an additional income to be made by providing gardens to tenants. These were then known as guinea gardens, but they were more about the delights of leafy retreat and self-sufficiency, with summer houses and pretty borders and butterflies.
Just for a moment, hold that thought of gardens with summer houses and flowers. Because last year I went to Sweden, and in Stockholm we trekked across the city because I wanted to visit the Tanto Park, where 100 allotment gardens were established around 1910 as part of an urban policy. What I found was not what I expected. If I say allotment to you, I suspect that you, like me, think of lots of rectangular plots of land, side by side, full of veg, sunflowers, small sheds. What I found in Stockholm were individual plots, divided by picket fences with beautiful summer houses, trees, flowers, lawns. I chatted to one of the gardeners who said, "We got the idea from you in the UK." I'm not sure if that's true, and I was certainly puzzled because our allotments don't look anything like this. But I will soon be taking you to a similar magical site in the UK. So-called detached gardens opened in 1845 in Warwick for Victorian city dwellers whose homes had no gardens. These are individual plots divided by hedges with summer houses and fruit trees, so maybe the idea did come from here. Though, as Lally said, land is a commodity, and those detached gardens, which could apparently be found in many towns and cities in the UK, disappeared. The city of Stockholm and its surroundings now has around 10,000 of these allotment gardens, and I'd love to hear from someone who has one of those plots. But meanwhile, back in the UK...
the utilitarian allotment sort of won out, especially in cities, and tracts of wasteland, bogs, disused fields not filled for building on, were all put to better use. And by 1873, there were 245,000 allotments across Britain. But then, of course, in 1914, the war broke out. And at that time, Britain was importing 80% of its fruits and all of its sugar from around its colonies in America, Australia, South Africa. And then, of course, in 1917, Kaiser Wilhelm threatened to starve the British people with his U-boats. And, imports they basically ground to a halt. And allotmentitis really gripped the country. People were really, really hungry at this point as well. And new plots of land were created every week in parks and playing fields, any land at all. Land was requisitioned in public parks. People went to extraordinary lengths to turn the lowliest scrap of nothing. I think there's a famous example of a rubbish tip in Battersea that was used as a chute for dust carts. And it was previously declared unused until it was cleared by volunteers to become a beautiful, tidy set of allotments. The government set up model allotments throughout the London parks and St James's Park, the Albert Memorial, Regent's Park. And then people were encouraged there was encouragement of competitions to kind of, provide a bit of excitement. And then prize-winning exhibits were then used to buy cigarettes for the war wounded or donated to hospitals. And they kind of helped to foster this sense of patriotism.
What happens between World War I and World War II?
Well, everyone thinks of it as being, the roaring 20s and the bright young things, but actually it was pretty awful still. There was huge depression, there was a general strike, there was mass inflation in Britain, there was no money, and hundreds of thousands of newly demobilised soldiers were looking for work. So there was a mass unemployment as well. And there was a high housing crisis. And allotments were really vulnerable to being dug over, they were being re-requisitioned, people who had them in the war, so people were disillusioned. And then World War II came out, begun, and the war ags, there's a very long, complicated name that was shortened to war ags, it's like the Department for War and Agriculture. Obviously, war didn't suddenly break out, people knew it was on the brink, so they had this system lined up, they had their ducks in order for allotments and growing your own veg to start again. It's almost as if the First World War was a dress rehearsal. And then, the wheels of agriculture needed to operate at full capacity once again. And the experts at the Ministry of Agriculture worked out that 500,000 plots could support 1 million adults or 1.5 million children for 8 months. And there are other sort of funny statistics. 100 acres of potatoes could feed 400 people for a year. 100 acres of oats could feed 170, whereas beef put to pasture on the same acreage would just feed 9 people. So really that was when self-sufficiency came into its own. No patch of land went undug. Oxford quads, parks, tennis courts, the Tower of London moat, Buckingham Palace. But there was a bit of a lack of knowledge because people had forgotten what happened in the First World War. So they reinstalled these model allotments all over London and other bigger cities. And then they had week-long Dig for Victory events, touring the country with local celebrities. Walt Disney invented Dr. Carrot. Potato Pete came into play then. Cookbooks were introduced to help use up, the rancid bits of spring greens and potato peelings. But then crime, interestingly, was on the up because, these vegetables became commodities. It was amazing. In my research, I found that people were creating allotments out of bomb craters. So there was an amazing photograph, and I'm sure it was propaganda, but it's a photograph of a man digging a crater at, I think it's either Westminster Cathedral or Westminster Abbey. It's a sort of oval-shaped crater. And there he is with his bean rows and his tomatoes, surrounded by buildings and concrete. I mean, that really is a middle finger to the Blitz bombers, if ever there was one.
So after the war, bring us up to date now. Where are we at with allotments now?
During the pandemic, I think when we couldn't get the food we needed, the food we wanted, and we couldn't be outside unless it was for a valid purpose, that's when allotments really started to become popular again, because there was a valid reason to be outside growing your own food. You had more control over what you had, where it came from, what went into it. You knew what pesticides, if any, you were using. And there was a sense of sort of this wholesomeness and this community. It's, in real life community on an allotment plot. Whether you like it or not, you're going to be next to somebody and you don't have to talk to them. But during the pandemic, I suspect people like that. And then
Are we ever going to have enough, though? Because I always think of allotments and allotment lists, basically, and long waiting lists. I mean, was that what you found when you were doing your research, that the reality is that more and more of us are living in urban spaces now, and it's hard for that to kind of keep up because there's a demand for houses, and so it's always a bit of a battle.
1 in 5 people across the country have access to outside space, and in London, I think it's 1 in 8, which means access to at least a bit of land for a garden or a balcony. And when all these big building developments are going on, that quota of land can often be sacrificed for a communal garden because it's cheaper, and developers don't really care if you have land or not, because land is a commodity. It always will be. And will we ever have enough? I don't know. It just seems that everywhere I go, and I live in rural England, and everywhere I go now, I keep seeing development, housing. There are fields that are fine. I get it that we need houses, but there are fields now that are, now contain 200 houses, and that's 200 extra cars. It's 200 extra, not it's just concreted over areas basically. And waiting lists are in London, in one London borough, there's 24 years, I think. And there's some.
Gosh, you almost need to put yourself on it as soon as you can wield a spade, really, don't you, in order to know that by the time it happens.
Current waiting lists in total are 175,000 names. 175,000 people are waiting for an allotment. And that's just on, I think that's just on the council run allotments. That's to say nothing of the parish council ones, which don't really hit the figures. But there are people doing some interesting things with private allotments in places like Bristol and Bath. There's a sort of an Airbnb style allotment site in London where people who have a garden but don't want to garden it rent it out to people who want to grow things.
And all this research, what did it leave you feeling at the end of it? Did it leave you feeling, yep, I need to get out there and talk about allotments for people to understand them? Or did it leave you feeling, I need an allotment? Where did it leave you at the end of all of that research and work that you did?
A bit of both. I think it left me feeling much more connected to what we have and to what we need to live. And I'd love to actually do it much more scientifically and work out. There's a great program on the BBC last week about it, like somebody being self-sufficient for a year. What do you actually need to feed a family of 5 for a year properly? Not just a bit of lettuce here and there, or cucumbers and seasonal things like that. How many kilos of potatoes? And it left me really feeling like, I think there is another 21st century allotment movement. And I want more and more people to be aware of what they can do. And I mean, even when I was recording the audio for the book, the young producers who are really lovely, and they live in London and Peckham or Brixton or something, they sort of say, oh, I've got a little sort of front garden, I was thinking about doing something. I don't really know how to. I'm like, I don't know how to. If I can do it as a mother of 3 small children, you can do it. It's not difficult. Get some seeds, plant them in the ground and go for it. And that's where it starts from. And it's just, it's having that independence and being autocratic when it comes to knowing what you're eating and how you're eating and where it comes from, that's such a wonderful thing.
Lally Snow's book, My Family and Other Seedlings, is out now. I hope that Kathy's radishes and this bonus episode will not be our last visit to the veg patch. So if you have a plant story from an allotment that you would like to share, do get in touch. Sally@ourplantstories.com. Our Plant Stories is presented and produced by me, Sally Flatman. Thank you for listening. If you want to show your support for this podcast via Buy Me a Coffee, then the link is in the show notes or on the website ourplantstories.com. I promise you, your virtual coffee will go towards the podcast, not plants.